Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a housing association that built a house on my land. It was a late summer afternoon, and I just finished a long drive through winding roads to check out the mountain plot I had bought for a future vacation home. My main plan had been to build a modest summer escape there whenever I had enough savings. I wasn't in a rush. I simply wanted to own this piece of serenity, high in the mountains, overlooking the peaks in the distance. Little did I know, while I was busy with life in the city, someone had found my plot far too tempting to leave alone. I still recall how I first noticed that something was off. Driving along the gravel road that circled the hillside, I saw a shape in the distance, dark, angular, too large to be just a shed or a temporary structure. At first I thought maybe I'd taken a wrong turn, or maybe one of the neighbors had built a new place. But as I kept driving, I realized that the house, if you could call it that, was exactly where my plot was supposed to be. The outlines of the slope, the two old pines near the corner, the boulders on the eastern edge, they all told me that this suspicious new house stood smack in the middle of my property. I pulled over near the driveway area, which I recognized from my previous visits, though it was now covered in patches of fresh gravel. I got out of my car and stared at the structure. It was bizarrely tall, with a slanted roof that didn't match anything else around. The siding looked like cheap plywood that had been painted over in an attempt to mask its poor quality. My first thought was to wonder if there had been some massive mistake by a construction crew. But I knew, at the back of my mind, that the mistake here wasn't some random mix-up. There were too many details that indicated a purposeful, if sloppy job. Brand new steps leading up to the front door, half-finished window frames, and something that looked like an area for a deck in the back. I stood there absolutely stunned for several long minutes. Then, a neighbor from across the hill, a man named Orion whom I had spoken with once or twice in the past, happened to drive by. He slowed down, saw me standing with my car door open, and asked if I was okay. I stammered that I was just trying to figure out who had built this place. His reaction was surprising. He didn't look shocked. Instead, he told me he'd seen crews come by, but that it had seemed official. He had assumed I'd finally decided to build. That alone was enough to make me realize that whoever had put this structure here had done it with some sense of legitimacy, or at least the appearance of it. After Orion drove off, I walked around my property, noticing all sorts of clues that contractors had been out here for at least a few months. Fresh concrete near the foundation, newly cleared shrubs, and leftover building materials stacked in one corner. The ground was littered with splinters of wood and nails. The more I looked, the more furious I became. This was my land. I had the deed sitting in a safe deposit box. No one had asked my permission to build anything. Even in my stunned state, I realized there had to be something bigger going on. Back in my car, I tried to calm down, but my heart was pounding. I made a few phone calls. The first was to my friend Tara, who is a property lawyer in the city. She told me to document everything, take pictures, maybe talk to the neighbors more, and then figure out who had authorized the construction. I also called a different friend, Dustin, who sometimes dealt with real estate in mountainous areas. He advised me to check with the local county records to see if any permit had been pulled under my name. That was exactly the kind of logical approach I needed to hear. My anger was still there, but at least I had a plan. I spent the rest of that evening circling the so-called house, snapping photographs and writing down everything that seemed relevant. I caught glimpses of the brand name on some leftover lumber. The nails on the deck were obviously not stainless steel, which is typically necessary for mountain climates to prevent rust. I saw a half-attached gutter that looked like it would barely last a season. Someone had basically thrown up walls and a roof with minimal care. Never mind that they didn't have the right to build here in the first place. And somewhere in the pit of my stomach, I had the sinking feeling that I knew exactly who was behind it. You see, when I had originally bought this land, I had to register with a local homeowners association, HOA. At the time, it struck me as odd since I wasn't building immediately, but apparently the entire mountain region was under a broader covenant that required membership if you owned property along certain roads. The HOA president, a man named Gregory, had introduced himself back then. He was friendly enough on the surface, but the kind of friendly that you can't quite trust. He had asked for my phone number and email. I reluctantly gave them, figuring it was part of the standard contact procedure. Over the next few years, I'd occasionally get newsletters or meeting announcements from that HOA, but I never attended. Because I didn't have a house on the land yet, I didn't see the point. I had never had any issues or obligations. just a small yearly fee to keep the roads maintained. In hindsight, it made perfect sense. Gregory had my contact info, so if there had been some legitimate reason for a construction project on my property, I would have heard from him, but he had not called me or emailed me once. Instead, I found an entire building on my plot, which meant that if it was the HOA's doing, they had to have done it behind my back. The question was why. Money was the most obvious reason. Maybe they wanted to build a rental property or perhaps sell it under the table. But it was mind-boggling that they would risk such an obviously illegal move. Before going to the authorities, I decided it wouldn't hurt to give the HOA one chance to explain themselves. The next morning, I drove down to the local HOA office building, which was located near a small cluster of shops that catered to the mountain community. The office was modest, just a couple of desks, some filing cabinets, and a large table for meetings. I marched in, told the front desk volunteer that I needed to speak with Gregory immediately, and was told he would be in shortly. About half an hour later, he walked in wearing an unseasonably crisp suit. He looked surprised to see me there, but he greeted me with that same suspiciously friendly tone. I didn't waste time on small talk. I told him plainly and firmly that a house had appeared on my land, and I believed the HOA might have had something to do with it. Gregory's face changed colors in a matter of seconds. He tried to act bewildered, claiming he had no idea what I was talking about. However, I could see from the tension in his jaw that he was stalling. I told him to cut the nonsense and explain how something like this could happen on my property. He finally stuttered out that there had been a community improvement initiative, and that apparently my land had been confused with a nearby plot that was slated for a new caretaker's cottage. He apologized, but in a painfully fake manner. He said it was unfortunate, but that maybe we could work something out. I kept a tight lid on my anger. I told him to gather any building permits or paperwork he had that showed the HOA had authority to build there. He muttered something about the original caretaker's cottage plan, and that the contractor might have expanded the project in error. That might have been the most absurd excuse I'd ever heard. There's no way an entire house could be built on the wrong plot with no one catching the mistake for months. Gregory then tried to pivot and said maybe I should just keep the house. If I would sign some paperwork, the HOA would recognize that the structure was on my land, and I could be responsible for its maintenance. He even tried to sweeten the deal, saying the HOA would pay for the finishing touches and that I could rent it out through their preferred property management service. I was speechless for a moment. The audacity was staggering. He wanted me to adopt this cheaply built eyesore which violated my property rights in the first place, just to save the HOA from any trouble. I stood up, thanked him for his time in the most clipped tone I could muster, and told him I needed to consult with my lawyer. The spark of panic in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. He knew I had a right to be furious. He also knew that if I pressed charges or filed a lawsuit, the HOA would be in serious legal trouble. But clearly, he was hoping to spin it into a scenario where I accepted the house as some kind of half-baked settlement. That afternoon, I drove down to the county building department to see if any permits had been filed under my name or my lot number. After waiting in line for a while, I finally got to speak with a clerk who helped me run a search. There was nothing on file for my lot. However, there was a record of a building permit for a caretaker's dwelling for the general community, but it was supposed to be on a different section of land owned by the HOA. The plot numbers weren't even close to mine. It looked as though the HOA had taken that caretaker plan, relabeled some documents, and tried to pass off the construction as official. Of course, no one from the county had actually inspected it because the final inspection had never been called. If they had done an inspection, the situation might have come to light earlier. Armed with this information, I phoned Tara again, the lawyer friend. She was astounded. She asked me to email her all the documentation and photos I had. She said we probably had a rock-solid case if we wanted to sue, but before we went that route, she suggested I figure out what I wanted to do about the structure itself. Did I actually want to keep it and force the HOA to bring it up to code? Did I want it off my land entirely? Did I want to sell the property? She explained that if we entered litigation, the building could become a complicated piece of evidence, and it might be tied up for a long time. I didn't hesitate. I told her I wanted it gone. One look at that hastily slapped-together plywood fortress told me it was more trouble than it was worth. There was also a matter of principle. The HOA had built a house on my property without even telling me, let alone asking permission. No way was I keeping it. Tara then helped me draft a formal cease and desist letter, which we sent to the HOA's office. It demanded that they remove the structure or provide a plan to do so within a short time frame. If they didn't, I'd have the right to remove it at their expense. About a week went by. During that time, I stayed in the area. I wanted to keep a close eye on the property. Each day I visited, the site looked more forlorn. No one was coming to continue construction. It seemed the HOA had paused whatever plan they had, but they also didn't respond to the cease and desist letter in any official capacity. I only got a single email from Gregory saying he was trying to figure out the best possible resolution. I was not impressed. Meanwhile, I found out from a different local resident, Margot, who ran a small cafe near the foot of the mountain, that Gregory had bragged weeks earlier about a new property the HOA would rent out to weekend tourists. Margot told me that Gregory claimed it would make the HOA a nice sum of money during the ski season, and that he had found a creative solution for land usage. The more I heard, the angrier I got. Clearly, they were planning to illegally rent out a property on my land and pocket the proceeds. Margot also mentioned that she heard some of the board members were uncomfortable with the arrangement, but apparently, Gregory had convinced them it was all legal. I was appalled at the level of deceit. After giving the HOA ample time to respond, I decided to move forward. I hired a demolition crew. Or, to be more precise, I hired a contractor who had experience safely taking down structures that were either condemned or not up to code. We went through all the steps. I showed them my deed, explained that this structure had been illegally built on my land, and that I'd sent legal notice to have it removed. We followed all local regulations for demolition, including scheduling a day for safe removal and disposal of construction debris. I did give the HOA one final heads up. A phone call to Gregory went straight to voicemail, so I left a calm message stating that if I didn't hear back within 24 hours with a solid plan to remove the illegal structure, I would proceed with demolition. The next morning, I still had no response. At that point, I felt I had done my due diligence. I called in the crew. It was a bright, clear day when they arrived. I remember standing off to the side, out of the safety perimeter, watching as the bulldozer rumbled up the slope. Part of me felt an odd sense of pity for the building itself. It wasn't the house's fault it was constructed under unethical circumstances, but I was also grimly satisfied to see the walls come crashing down. The contractor had told me that since the house was so poorly built, it might practically fall in on itself, which is exactly what happened when they started. I took videos and photos for documentation. Within hours, most of the structure was reduced to rubble. By the end of the day, all that remained was a foundation slab, some debris, and a big dumpster that the crew would haul away for disposal. Right on cue, as if orchestrated by the universe, Gregory finally showed up in his car just as the final portion of the structure was being torn down. He jumped out and started yelling that I had no right to do this, that the HOA owned that house, and that I was going to be in serious legal trouble. The demolition crew had strict instructions not to engage, so they simply kept working. I stood in front of him, letting him rant, and finally said in the calmest voice I could manage that the HOA was trespassing on my land. I had legal proof. I had demanded that they remove the structure. They had not done so, and now I was exercising my right to remove it. Gregory's face turned red. He threatened lawsuits, massive fines, even said something about calling the police. I invited him to go ahead and do so. It was my property, and I was well within my rights. As expected, the sheriff's deputies arrived after Gregory called. My deed, HOA letter, and demolition permits were ready. Before pulling me aside, the deputies listened to Gregory complain for several minutes. Calmly explaining the situation, I handed over the paperwork. After reviewing everything, deputies shook their heads at Gregory. Since this was a civil matter, they told him they had no recourse and I was within my rights. Gregory left irate, but I could tell he was planning his next move. Over the next few days, the HOA sent me angry letters on official-looking stationery claiming I had destroyed community property. I saved every one to share with Tara. 3 weeks later, I received legal papers stating that the HOA was suing me for damages. They demanded the house's price plus extravagant fees for lost rental income and community distress. I wasn't surprised, but I was annoyed that they doubled down instead of solving this maturely. Tara prepared my defense and counterclaim with everything I gave her. She claimed the HOA had no right to the house on my land and had violated multiple property laws by trespassing and building without my consent. We had proof Gregory boasted about profits. Most importantly, we had the building permit fiasco in black and white. No reasonable judge would side with the HOA because the permit was for a different lot. Court date came a month later. The nerves and excitement as Tara and I entered that small-town courthouse will never leave me. Gregory was with an unfamiliar lawyer, and 2 HOA board members sat behind them, looking uneasy. The hearing was simple. I presented the facts. The deed was in my name. The permit was not for my property. The HOA had my contact info but never asked permission, and the cease and desist letter was ignored. Photos of the demolition and HOA letters confirming they owned an unpermitted structure on unowned land were included. Gregory's lawyer claimed that the HOA made a simple mistake in good faith and that I had demolished the structure instead of working with them. But the judge didn't take it seriously. When Tara showed the judge the permit was for a different lot, the shift was clear. The judge raised his eyebrows and asked Gregory how a caretaker's cottage became an unofficial rental property on someone else's land. Gregory mumbled something about a clerical error, but it was useless. My property was trespassed and used without permission, so the judge dismissed the HOA's lawsuit and awarded me damages. It was more than enough to cover demolition costs, legal fees, and potential lost land use while the structure was there. The judge stated that the HOA had exceeded boundaries in a remarkable way. A thorough condemnation occurred in that courtroom. After the ruling, the HOA had to pay my damages and legal fees. Tara's bills would be paid without my worry. Most importantly, it sent a strong community message. Gregory's attempt to profit from my property failed. His fellow board members scrambled to clean up. In subsequent weeks, there were rumors that Gregory could face personal repercussions, including criminal charges, if further investigation revealed he had forged or falsified official documents. It may not have gone that far, but he was fired as HOA president soon after. I finally had time to decide what to do with my land. With the settlement money, I was inspired to build my dream cabin. A few days walking around the plot, I imagined a simple but sturdy structure that would let me enjoy the crisp mountain air without overshadowing the land's beauty. I talked to some trusted local builders who care about safety codes and quality craftsmanship. In retrospect, another side plot was intriguing. My friend Milo was starting a small eco-lodge. He wanted to build a network of sustainable mountaintop cabins with local timber and few resources. After hearing about my HOA mishap, he invited me to join his new venture. He proposed that I build a small, eco-friendly cabin on my land and join his lodge network, which would bring like-minded travelers each year. Despite its appeal, I wasn't ready to turn my land into a business. I agreed to meet with him to discuss it. We discussed geodesic domes, small A-frames, and cabins with living roofs that blend in. It was fun to imagine something good from such a stressful situation. Unfortunately, geographical boundaries kept me technically in that HOA. I was wary of building anything that might attract attention or meddling. Milo and I read the HOA covenants and were relieved to find that we could build if the structure met aesthetic guidelines like color schemes, height restrictions, and sewage setups. After everything that happened, the HOA probably couldn't challenge a legal project. My trust in that organization was at an all-time low. I scheduled a meeting with recent board members who had replaced Gregory's allies or were not in his inner circle. They appeared eager to resolve issues to avoid further lawsuits. I envisioned an eco-friendly cabin as my retreat and possibly part of Milo's lodge network. I promised to handle permits and code requirements carefully. They nodded and requested a courtesy presentation at the next board meeting. Just to keep the peace, I agreed. By the next board meeting, word had spread about my court victory. Some neighbors who barely knew me started shaking my hand, saying Gregory had abused his position for years. He allegedly threatened to fine people for minor offenses like painting their fences the wrong color of brown and tried to charge exorbitant fees. My win encouraged other property owners to file complaints. One family might sue the HOA for shady fines they paid under protest. The board meeting allowed me to present my cabin design. Local stone formed the base of this simple building with a pitched roof and small porch. I also wanted to install solar panels to reduce my carbon footprint, which ironically fit with the HOA's mission to preserve the area's natural beauty. They had no reason to refuse. I answered their questions about the exterior paint color and waste management system thoroughly. The board approved my plan without much fuss, not wanting to cause trouble. However, I worried that some older residents might still resent me for taking away a community amenity. Many of them supported me after learning the truth, to my surprise. They seemed to have heard rumors about the unfortunate caretaker's cottage, but didn't realize it was built on private land without permission. Once they knew the truth, they supported me. Some laughed that the caretaker's cottage was so poorly built that it would have collapsed in a big storm. Dustin, my real estate friend, told me local property values were rising during this time. He said that, ironically, the attention may have made my land more desirable. Despite not wanting to sell, knowing I had options was comforting. The HOA's insanity in building on someone else's land became a local legend. I wasn't alone in that region's absurd situation. Another subplot involved Jade, a neighbor a few valleys away. Jade had trouble with the same HOA over a deck she built without the right shade of wood stain approval. The HOA fined her daily until she complied. She joined a local group of property owners who wanted to make the HOA rules more transparent and less harsh. I supported Jade's cause because I knew how a sweeping HOA could ruin your life. Jade's group received enough support to propose at the annual membership meeting. One proposal would require the HOA board to present all major projects to members in writing before construction, especially if the HOA planned to use membership fees. Another proposal tightened building permit oversight to prevent someone from building an entire structure with an incorrect permit. I attended that meeting out of curiosity and to help others avoid my experience. The proposals sparked debate, with older board members complaining that the rules would slow improvements. Jade said it was better to slow down and do things right than face lawsuits and huge fines for trespassing. Both proposals passed by a large margin, establishing HOA accountability. I started building my cabin. Building in mountains is difficult, especially if you want to do it right. Everything from slope stability to roof snow load was considered. I hired Brent, a trusted local contractor with experience building cabins that survived heavy winds and snowfall. Brent and his small crew carefully dug footings, used high-quality lumber, and reinforced the roof. I drove up every few days to check on progress and felt relieved to reclaim my land on my own terms. As the cabin frame rose, my HOA anxiety eased. Seeing something done right after something done wrong empowered me. Brent sometimes joked, "At least you don't have to worry about your place collapsing in a wind gust," referring to the caretaker's cottage's poor construction. We laughed about it, but I never forgot how infuriating it was to find that unauthorized structure. A few months later, the cabin was nearly finished. Solar panels shone on the roof, windows framed stunning mountain views, and the interior smelled like fresh cedar. I decided to host a small party for my neighbors, both old and new, to celebrate the cabin's completion. My informal invitation stated that I would have warm drinks and light snacks, and that it would be a casual open house. I worried that the HOA drama would overshadow the gathering on the day of. Everyone was happy, which was a relief. They liked the cabin's craftsmanship, coziness, and views. One older couple told me they had never realized my plot's spectacular view until now. Jade came by to say the rule changes resolved her deck dispute, and she was glad she didn't have to tear anything down. We laughed and felt proud for defending our rights. Even Orion, the neighbor who first saw me staring at the unauthorized house, came in with homemade cookies. He joked that the property had gone from random monstrosity to most inviting cabin in the area. Margot, the cafe owner who told me about Gregory's boasting, approached me with a wry smile. She said Gregory had allegedly left town. She wasn't sure if it was true, but after losing the lawsuit, he was scrutinized over the HOA's finances, revealing irregularities. She heard whispers of personal fund siphoning, but no proof was available. Regardless, he resigned as president and left. I felt sorry for this man, whose greed and hubris had cost him everything, including his reputation. But his pity was outweighed by relief that his schemes wouldn't harm anyone. As the night went on, people left, leaving me to enjoy my new mountain cabin. Leaning on the porch railing, I watched the sun set behind the distant range. A light breeze carried pine scent. Ironically, I was standing here fuming at an unauthorized house just a short time earlier. I felt accomplished and reassured that property rights are always worth fighting for. My first night in the cabin was on a simple cot. The window showed an endless tapestry of stars due to the clear sky. As I lay there, I thought about everything that had happened. The shock of finding the house, the confrontation with Gregory, the demolition, the lawsuit, and the final legal victory that made the HOA compensate me and pay my legal fees. I also considered Jade's deck dispute, Margot's account of Gregory's bragging, and the new board rules. All of it was surreal but satisfying. I knew I would always regret caving or compromising to let the HOA get away with their wrongdoing. Instead, I defended my rights and made lasting changes that may help others in the community. A pleasant routine developed in the weeks that followed. Work kept me in the city, but I visited the cabin whenever I could. Each time I climbed the mountain, I felt free and knew my property was mine, untainted by others' shady ambitions. I kept up with neighbors who became friends and shared local events and wildlife sightings. I was invited to join Jade and others on a weekly hike to explore lesser-known trails. Orion brought garden produce occasionally. Margot occasionally shared small-town gossip, but nothing as dramatic as the house on the wrong lot. Because the HOA lost so badly in court, they seemed to be less likely to meddle. The newly reformed board encouraged members to attend monthly meetings, voice concerns, and suggest improvements. The community atmosphere improved greatly. The administration no longer seemed power-hungry. Instead, they seemed more willing to collaborate to improve the neighborhood. I invited Milo to check out the cabin during one of my extended stays to see if it could join his eco-lodge network. He brought 2 sustainability-focused colleagues. They loved the cabin's landscape integration. We talked about composting and rainwater collection on the porch. I liked hosting eco-conscious travelers in my cabin, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to sell it. The conversation inspired me to preserve the land's natural beauty for the future. Just when I thought the drama was over, the HOA's lawyer sent me a final letter acknowledging that the lawsuit was over and that they would pay the court-ordered damages and fees in installments. The letter was incredibly polite, almost apologetic. It confirmed my undisputed ownership of the property and that they would not contest future building plans if I followed the usual guidelines. It also requested that I not sue them again. Tara laughed while reading. "They're basically begging you to leave them alone," she said. "As long as they didn't try anything else, I wouldn't prolong the conflict. Peace was more important." Looking back, I was amazed how quickly property rights violations can escalate. I was also surprised that a community-serving HOA could go rogue under poor leadership. Justice won, though. The illegal, poorly built house was demolished. The HOA compensated me and changed their rules to prevent power abuses. Gregory lost his job and possibly his community standing. I built my dream cabin with new neighbors and friends who supported me through the mess. After 2 years, my cabin is fully furnished and my favorite place to relax. I often drive up on Friday nights, open the windows for fresh air, and sit on the porch with coffee, staring at the majestic peaks. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had been more passive or accepted the HOA's offer to keep their shabby structure. I would have had a headache for years and never felt at home in a place I didn't authorize or design. Friends, thank you. See you soon.